Aloha colleagues and welcome to OC 6005, Scope and Methods of Research. The title of this presentation is The Foundation and Some Terminology. This week we will be reading chapters 5 through 7 in Measuring the Success of Organization Development textbook. We have two additional articles. They are titled What Theory Is Not and What Makes Management Research Interesting, and Chapter 3, which is pages 22 to 38 in Essentials of Behavioral Science Research. And that is actually a PDF that's attached to our Blackboard page right underneath the other two articles. The deliverables that are due, we're going to watch the videos on the Milgram experiments and the Stanford prison experiment. I'd like you to click through and read the information contained in the HPU IRB presentation. And then, planning ahead for the next unit, you are going to complete the NIH training course on protecting human research participants. It is due on September 20th. Please note it will take you about 3 hours to complete, so this is not something that you want to wait until right before the deadline to begin. We had a discussion in the face-to-face section of this course on the article that we read last week. That article was Evidence on Questionable Research Practices, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I do want to clarify some of the research methods jargon, and I think it might help with your understanding of the article in general, and also it's going to help build a foundation for moving forward and creating your own research proposal. So if you look at the first page of that article, it mentions that it uses the method of triangulation to come to their conclusions for this particular study. So just to clarify, triangulation, it's a method used by qualitative researchers, and essentially they use it to check and establish validity in their studies by analyzing research from multiple perspectives. I have included an additional video on this week's page that goes into a little more detail on triangulation. Another term that you're going to hear a lot is statistical significance. And this is a bit of a touchy subject with researchers because most, if not all, journals want to publish research that showed statistical significance when they tested their hypotheses. So essentially, they want to know that your hypotheses were supported. Now, this does create issues even if you build and design a research study and unfortunately your hypotheses were not supported. The way the process is set up in academia, you are more likely to have your article published in a scholarly journal if your findings show statistical significance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this presentation. The next term that we come across, and this is towards the bottom on the first page, it's called cherry picking. In particular, they're talking about cherry picking certain fit indices that support your claims in the research paper. So when you conduct your analysis of your data, you will get a lot of fit indices if you are using quantitative methods. So using statistical programs to help you come to some conclusions. And some of the output that the computer program will give you, some of those matrices are going to support your research better than some of the others. So what we're talking about here is it's unethical to just pick those fit indices that match what you're trying to demonstrate. You do need to report everything, even if it's not in the best interest of showing statistical significance. The next thing is post hoc hypotheses. Now, what's interesting is in the research process, we develop hypotheses or research propositions before we do any data collection or analysis. So the authors here are talking about collecting data, analyzing it, and then making hypotheses. So they're actually doing the process backward. So in academia, that is also considered unethical and certainly a questionable research practice. And in that same sentence where it talks about post hoc hypotheses, it also uses a Latin phrase called a priori. What the heck could that mean? I know research methods is a difficult subject to learn without having to learn it in Latin. So a priori means making the decision or proposition before anything else. Our final term here, and I believe this is on the next page, it's called harking. And you will hear this term every now and then. And if you aren't familiar with this acronym, it can be kind of confusing. But harking actually stands for hypothesizing after results are known. So again, that kind of goes back to our post hoc hypotheses discussion. There was a particular sentence in this article, and it's on page 324, that really stuck with me, and I wanted to make sure that everyone in the class really let this sentence sink in. So all methodological approaches have limitations and are only as accurate as their underlying assumptions. So in this particular article, they did look at 4 major areas to help determine the frequency of questionable research practices in published research. So they looked at behavioral observations, and they talk about the pros and cons there. Sensitivity analysis, pros and cons there. Self-report surveys, in particular, some of the bias of answers and some of the problems with using self-report surveys. And finally, observer report surveys. In particular, they talked about how people were less likely to report if they themselves had partaken in questionable research practices, but they were much more likely to report a colleague for conducting questionable research practices. So that's certainly very interesting in our discussion here. Towards the end of the article, it talks about recommendations for publication practices and academic training. So I thought it would be helpful for our colleagues to understand what the process is from research conception to publication in a scholarly journal. I'm going to briefly go over these practices here, but I'm also uploading more videos to the Blackboard page from the publisher Sage. That's one of the major publishers in management and organization development research that answers a lot more questions about the publication process. But let's go ahead and take a look at the brief overview. So we start with the idea for a research paper. The academics work on writing that manuscript, and then usually what happens is they submit the manuscript to a conference with a blind peer review process. So what that means is the paper is sent out for review to other individuals that have expertise in that area. For example, if the paper is on influence tactics in leadership, the conference will identify participants that have experience in leadership research and, if possible, someone with publishing experience on influence tactics. They remove the name of the authors off the manuscript and then let the reviewers read the paper and give comments. So feedback is received from the reviewers, and essentially the reviewers will give a thumbs up or thumbs down decision on whether or not the paper should be presented at the conference. So assuming that the paper is accepted, the authors of the manuscript will incorporate the feedback that they received from the reviewers, and an updated version of the manuscript is then submitted back to the conference chairs. At that point, the authors will present the manuscript to an audience at whatever conference it is. You will then receive feedback from conference participants. Usually you give a 30-minute presentation with 15 minutes of questions and answers, and then you revise the manuscript based on that feedback as well. Once you're at this point, you will select an appropriate journal. Now, what does that mean, and how do you identify a journal to publish in? In business research, in particular at HPU, we utilize the Cabell's International Database. So if you go to our library tabs in Pipeline and you click on the databases link, scroll down to the letter C, and you'll see the Cabell's International Database link. So once you click on that, it'll take you to the Cabell site, and I encourage you to look up some of the journals that we are reading articles from in this course. So I've included this as a footnote in this presentation. So for example, search something like Administrative Science Quarterly, Leadership Quarterly, Organization Development Journal. You could even search Organization Research Methods. See what comes up. Cabell's then gives you information about that particular journal. It's going to tell you a percentage, which is the percent of accepted papers. And essentially what that means is if there is a 20% acceptance rate, that means for every 100 papers submitted, only 20 papers will be selected for publication in that journal. Obviously, scholars want a very low acceptance rate because that means that the journal is more prestigious. So once you've identified a journal, the manuscript is sent out for blind review with multiple peer reviewers, much like the process in the conference submission process. It is much more likely at this point that the journal has access to reviewers with a lot more knowledge on the particular subject. Once the review has taken place, the reviewers submit their feedback back to the editor. The editor reads the feedback, and essentially there are three possible decisions. First one, accept the manuscript as it is, revise and resubmit, and we usually call this an R&R. So the reviewers think that the paper has potential, but they'd like to see some changes, and then they would like to review those changes, or immediately reject the paper. So the R&R process can actually occur 3 to 4 times in succession. This process can take a long time, and when I say a long time, it could be upwards of 3 to 4 years that you have a particular manuscript that's under review and continues to go through the R&R process. The idea is that your paper is increasing in its rigor and incorporating theory at a higher level. I have never seen a paper go through the R&R process more than 3 times. I have heard of 4 times, but I have not experienced that myself. At that point, the editor of the journal will make the final decision on whether or not to publish the article. Now, the process that we just discussed is a long and painstaking process for any researcher, but perhaps there are some flaws in the publication process that drive academics to utilize questionable research methods or even unethical practices. For example, the tenure or promotion process. For professors, research is part of our job. So we are required to publish articles. It depends on the school for the number of articles, but for HPU, we are required to publish 2 journal articles every 5 years, and that does become a major deciding factor on an assistant professor being promoted to an associate professor, or likewise an associate professor being promoted to a full professor. Prestige also comes with the more publications that you have, or the more publications you have in really tough journals to get something published in. Research also has several ties to financial external funding or grants at the university level, so it can be a lucrative process to obtain a grant that brings in money to the university, brings in money to the college for you to continue conducting that research. The number of publications you have can also be a deciding factor in a professor's teaching load decisions. So essentially, that's how many classes a professor would teach per semester. Currently, I teach 3 courses per semester. If I were to have more publications, there is a possibility that I could teach 2 courses per semester, which would give me even more time for research. So let's ask the major question here. What is the solution to some of these issues? And overarchingly, certainly creating a process that promotes integrity and truth, although myself, Dr. Gibson, won't be able to change the publication process for all of academia. So I can, however, focus on the next suggestion, which is spending a considerable amount of time educating students how to conduct research in the right way. One of your assigned readings for this week was Chapter 3 that talked a lot about the terminology for research methods. And one of the major terms that was discussed in that chapter is the idea of a construct. So the author of that particular chapter suggests that a construct is a concept that has been deliberately and consciously invented or adopted for a special scientific process. Now, I read that definition over and over again, and it still didn't make very much sense to me. So let's talk about a different way to phrase that definition where it actually makes sense. I found a better definition in a different research methods textbook, and it's Schwab 2005. And Schwab suggests that defining constructs at a conceptual level is an essential first step in the development of construct valid measurements, which I agree with. He also goes on to suggest that a construct domain is an element that explains what a researcher has in mind for the construct. So it contains a dictionary-like statement that describes the construct domain. It speaks to what's included in the construct. Now, that definition makes a little bit more sense, but it's still not quite clear in what a construct really is. I do think we need a little more explanation. So let's go to the next slide. So most constructs studied in organization development and management studies are intangible in nature. So in the hard sciences, such as physics or chemistry or biology, we tend to measure things that we can actually see. So we may be able to measure mercury levels in the fish in the Pacific Ocean, or we can measure weight of certain chemicals. But in the social sciences, we measure things that we can't really see or touch. So, for example, we look at things such as employee satisfaction, organizational learning, leadership effectiveness, perceived organizational support. So that leads me to the next question. How would you explain what each of these constructs represents? It's not as easy as it looks. So let's go through an example. How would you define or operationalize the construct love? Now I've added in a footnote here that Lee 2007, and that's the chapter that you read for this week, calls this the operational definition. You will often hear me say, how are you operationalizing your construct? So this is the process of actually determining how you will define what it is that you're measuring. So I'd like you to pause the video and try to operationalize what love is. Jot down some notes on the scrap paper. I am going to give you a little bit of inspiration here, see if I can get the video to work. Okay, so once you're done jotting down some notes, go ahead and click on to the next slide. So what did you come up with? Several examples that I've heard students say in the past are things such as it's an affectionate feeling between a parent and a child, or it's a romantic feelings between two people. In the Greek language, the word agape is a Christ-like love, so a Christ-like affection. In Hawaiian, we have aloha. So there are many different ways to actually operationalize what love really is and how it would pertain to whatever research you're doing. But how you operationalize your construct is very important. For example, you wouldn't measure the construct office romantic relationship by operationalizing it as an affectionate bond formed between a mother and a child. So the rest of chapter 3 in the assigned reading for this week goes into more detail about constructs and variables. So please send me any questions if you have any. I'm here to help. There is an additional reference that is not a required reading, and that was the Schwab reference that I made with a little more clear definition of construct. It's in the Research Methods for Organizational Studies book. I personally have the 2005 version, and that's what I quoted. I do believe, however, that there is an updated 2013 version. If you have the opportunity, this is a great textbook to pick up. You don't really need the 2013 version. You can use the 2005, but it's a great reference book. So if you get a chance, you might pick up a really good used copy of that book.